yeah, obviously in the West we've taken the self to be something very solid, very, very separate, very, very much we've mistaken self to be ourself. To such an extent that, it's very hard to, if you ask people to think of yourself in some other terms other than a self, it's like their mind just goes on tilt, And especially in our country, image is such a huge part of the self-structure. And all the advertising that's done, almost all of it has an element of image in it, self-image. And so, we've taken ourselves to be something very, very separate, and that not only are we a self, are we taught, but the self is sort of worshipped. Of course you see that in our worship of youth and looks and, all the ways, all the visual ways that we define self. And then, of course, then you have all the psychological ways that, because to me self is not just an image, right? It's a thought, it's something that's based in thought, of course, and image, that would be something you kind of like see in your mind, you might say, but those are also a conglomeration of thoughts. But also, even though self is an illusion, that illusion can have some very real effects. You could just say the word love to yourself, and you'll feel your body changing. You can say hate to yourself, and your body will take on that. Your emotions will start to feel that way. So this whole self-structure is something that we very much sort of wear kinesthetically, almost even bodily, and of course it distorts one's perception as well. And so there's really two ways of seeing through the self. One is a sort of a realization, oh, there is no self. Not to be convinced of that necessarily, because one can be convinced of it, but still very much be functioning from this illusion. But there can be the fundamental reality that there is no self, which is often kind of to transcend all the thoughts that are self-oriented. And then there's sort of the deeper experience, which is not just to realize that there is no self, but to actually have the experience of self literally disappear out of the brain structure, out of the emotional center, out of the way, of course, our perception. And that's something quite different, actually. And I often think that, certainly in spirituality, often one is mistaken for the other. That the realization of self, which is the transcending of self, is the same as the structure actually disappearing from, I guess you could say, your humanness. Well, I think even the idea that self might be an illusion. So as you said, that more and more science is starting to come to this conclusion too, that self is something that's not really there. Although there is an experience of it, there's very often a sense of self. But even as an idea, that's a huge step for human beings. That's a huge, just to allow that in is a big evolutionary step, because it opens up the bigger question. If I'm not a self, then what am I? And maybe there's an alternate, not only experience, but an alternate perspective through which one sees life and experiences life. And of course, when one experiences, when they have a realization of beyond self, when they transcend self, that has a very big impact on one's life. Very, very big. Not only internally, I think that goes without saying, but even the way that we relate and move in the world and communicate and what motivates us and what doesn't motivate us. That's a real transformation. And of course then, on the deeper movement is when the self that we may transcend actually really starts to disappear. completely, that's a whole other transformation. That's a whole other, I guess you could say, leap, but it's, yeah. So both of them would have a profound effect on. I think that the terror that people experience as they start to move beyond the boundary of self, so they start to wake up from self, the terror they feel is really when their reference point around which everything revolves, when that reference point starts to be seen through, the mind then projects sort of, because the mind can't enter into that. The mind can't know something that's beyond its domain, right? So when the mind can't know something that's beyond its domain, that doesn't stop it. It just projects something into that. So the mind can't know what you are outside of a self that it created, that thought created. But that doesn't stop thought. Thought imagines that that the only thing that could exist then would be this terrible, awful emptiness, this awful, terrible void. And so it unconsciously projects that into the mind, and then it can really terrify you. Do you know? But even that's an illusion too. Do you know? That's the mind trying to deal with the absence of self. And that's the nature of mind. The nature of mind is it's always trying to make sense of everything, right? That's how it's constructed, to make sense of things, to make sense out of chaos, to bring order to disorder. And there's nothing that's experienced more disordered than when the mind first peers beyond self. It does not know what to do with that. Yeah, that's often the experience of people have when they see beyond self. Is it's almost like taking off a very heavy backpack or overcoat or something. It's not just, oh, wow, there's great freedom. There's also a very, very palpable kinesthetic sense of a weight being taken off, because this illusion has a real kinesthetic and psychological and emotional heaviness to it, that we just become so accustomed that we don't know we're carrying it around, and then all of a sudden we see beyond it. And that weight lifts. And that's where the happiness and joy, it comes from that sort of buoyancy that immediately becomes part of experience. You know, we feel very sort of buoyant and vibrant and you know, infused with a sense of well-being. Well-being is really that which lies on the other side of self, outside of self, that encompasses self. And being isn't a self, do you know? It's being is actually that which is undescribable, and yet, since we communicate and we have minds, our minds like to describe things. But being is a word that indicates the substance of everything. So it would also mean the substance or the existence or the true nature of one's own being is beingness. Being is one of those things that's simultaneously something and nothing. Again, experientially, right? Not philosophically necessarily, but experientially, it's a something that's nothing, and it's not a self. When we experience it, then and strangely we see, like, this is what I've been avoiding my whole life. And I thought this was going to be, sometimes, you know, unconsciously the mind thinks this is going to be terrible if I go beyond self. But when it touches upon being, that's freedom. And it's also commonality. So your being, my being, anybody's, anything's, any being's being is, that's where we run into unity. Being is as such, being as a whole. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, obviously spirituality is undergoing a change. It's liberating itself from religion, which is both useful and not so useful. Because often the religious or the traditions, spiritual traditions, provided a sense of groundedness in which some of these very powerful experiences can occur, and there's a way that, you know, if you've come through that vehicle, there's a way that can help ground the experience. But obviously, true spirituality is, you know, not just some flippant idea of spirituality, but spirituality is breaking free of those traditional structures. I imagine they'll still be around in various forms, but they'll no longer be the exclusive, you know, holders of real, authentic, deep spirituality. That's becoming more secularized. And as I said, that has its good and not so good aspects. Everything rises that way, right? But that seems to be the direction it's going. That's what's happening right now. And I imagine will continue to happen for some time. Where that will go, you know, who knows? If we human beings I think if we're honest about one thing, we'll find that we are really not good at predicting the future. Although we love to do it, you know? We love to do it, but so often the future is almost always that which nobody really counted on. You know, it takes strange twists and strange turns, and you know, who knows where it will all end up. But in the moment, you know, it is, I think, really fascinating that how spirituality is breaking free of this sort of older domain, you know, and that helps it to become more accessible to more people, and it becomes easier to translate it into a language that people can actually relate to. It just makes it so much easier when people aren't having to almost relearn sort of a 2,000-year-old language. You know, even if it's, I don't mean learn an actual language, but you know, the words that people chose and the metaphors they used and the images they used, and so often what we have handed down to us are metaphors and images that worked 2,000 years ago. And just imagine how different is the world now from 2,000 years ago. I mean, how different is the world now from 50 years ago when I was born? You know, it's a different world. And so I think that's positive too, that it's like when spirituality starts to break out of these confines, it means that it becomes okay to retranslate it, to kind of bring it up to date and use ways of speaking, use images, use metaphors that relate to people. And all of a sudden, something that might have seemed so closed and strange and esoteric, all of a sudden it makes sense. Do you know? Because a lot of the esoteric part of it, in the sense of seeming to be strange and very hard to penetrate, a lot of that is just cultural and historical. You know, I imagine if somebody looks back, and if they use the way we talk, if they 2,000 years from now, if they try to use the same language we use, and the metaphors and the image, you know, it'll make no more sense to them than some of the images we make to us. You know, Adam and Eve was probably a really good image to use to explain the sort of like sense of brokenness, the sense of something's not quite right, that people, you know, what's not quite right? I don't know what's not quite right. Why do I feel ill at ease? Why do most people feel somewhat ill at ease? And so, you know, at some point someone sat around, they got, I'll make up a story. I'll make images, and I'll make things that can touch people, they can understand it, that it can be relevant to them. Now we read the story, and some people, you know, might feel that it just doesn't speak to them. And they might even, think of it as almost childish in a certain sense. But when it was created, it really spoke to them. And I imagine that it actually meant more to them than it means to a lot of people now. In other words, I think when these things were first created, a lot more people knew what was going on. They knew this is a story trying to describe human experience. And then with time, what gets forgotten is this is a story that's describing a human experience. All of a sudden it becomes, the story is like a philosophical truth or a metaphysical truth. Then it divorces us from our experience. So I think that one gets to re-examine that, and you kind of are refinding the threads of vitality of things that speak, and it's, as I said, just the sense of new language can make even an old form of spirituality can just bring it right to life. Just boom, all of a sudden it's right. It sings for you. Almost every part of life is undergoing incredibly fast change. I mean, and people are feeling there's a certain stress about it, because, I mean, we're not necessarily biologically hooked up to have change this fast. Do you know what I mean? We're changing in 10 years what might have taken hundreds and hundreds of years. And sometimes we forget that, that that's huge, just sort of on your nervous system, on your whole, its way of being. It can be quite, quite challenging. And yet, there's also a very positive side to that, As new structures get built and they get torn away, and then they get built and they torn away, and that turnover is like very, very quick. Even though most people would look around the world and see lots of old ways of looking at things that need to be, re-examined. And like you said, even enlightenment. The ideas of enlightenment has often, they kind of became old, crusty images that generations of people put their idea and image and image and image. And, after several hundred or 1,000 or 1,500 years, you get this you get this thing that's just laden with images, and most of the images are actually, they're various forms of Superman or Superwoman. Do you know what I mean? That's what I think a lot of the images that people have of enlightenment is actually a projection of who they'd like to be unconsciously, which is most people, they would like to be a Superman. They'd like to be a Superwoman. They like to be able to walk through walls or whatever, or go through some terrible, terrible thing without experiencing any pain, or, there's lots of strange images that I think more and more people are seeing through them because they're re-examining them. And like any point in time when things get re-examined, it's a tricky time, because there's always the danger of the baby getting thrown out with the bathwater. There's always the danger of, in other words, as in our necessary, this movement to sort of cast out unuseful ideas and images, that we also might just dummy everything down to a place that's really palatable for us. So to me there's some sort of middle ground of reality where we don't have things so hugely defined that, number one, they're not even true, but they make it really hard to access the reality that Enlightenment's talking about. But at the same time, that we don't, throw out some of the more challenging aspects of real deep spiritual maturity. So I think that's a sort of that's a balancing act. But that happens anytime, something undergoes a transformation. anytime. Well, I mean, what we're really describing is in this case, two very distinct forms of perception, right? Two very distinct stages of awakening. And one of those, often, that occurs for people is really the total transcendent stage. They wake up and out of the self-structure, the ego structure. They realize that's not really what I am. And then whatever concept they use to define what they are isn't particularly important necessarily. What's important is they've woken up from the egoic structure, and also even the physical body, the way, and of course then you could put gender into that too, all the ways that we define ourselves. And so a waking up is really, it's a shift of perception, is really what's occurring. And the perception they really often shift into is the real transcendent perception, which is, I'm not that, now I'm this, whether we call this pure consciousness or being or whatever the words are. And that's the way, I didn't say that this evening, but then we get the world down to a nice manageable duality. We have the nothingness of pure awareness or pure being, and then everything else, right? And everything else is right down to your human form, to all the other forms in existence and your day-to-day life, and then you experientially you get everything down to the formless and form, and it's very liberating because the realm of the formless, the transcendent, it's of another dimension than the world of form, and so it's not affected by it ultimately, and it doesn't. It's not concerned. It's not worried about things. Very, very liberating. Very freeing. But if one gets very, very deeply into that transcendent place and then gets stuck, because the ego actually can make its way in there and kind of go, ooh, this is what I always wanted. I always wanted to be safe and to be untouched and to find a place where I could never be harmed. And okay, unconsciously it can kind of go, okay, I'll be this, because this is safe and this is beautiful and it's transcendent. And so you can get stuck there. One of the symptoms of where you get stuck there is your relative life might start to fall apart. You know, your relationships, your work life, your lots of things, because most of you won't be engaged. You know, I've heard people say, you know, about their partners, like they're just not here anymore. It's like there's 5% of them that's here, and the other 90%, I don't know where they are, but they're not here. And things start to, you know, when you don't give time and attention, they start to fall apart. So it can be stuck, but even if you weren't stuck, it's just a particular stage of spiritual development, right? The totally transcendent state. But one of the indications is that it's not real, not ultimately the reality, is because it's not whole. It's got two things, you know, formless and form. And it's not whole, and reality is always whole. It's all-inclusive. And so a deeper state of maturity is when we really mature into what, I even hesitate to say the words because they're misleading too, but what unity really is. Which means you're discovering then what this is. What is this? Okay, I woke up from this, great, but what is this? What is this world of form? What actually really is it? We've given it so many names. What is it? And that can lead to or help open the way to a deeper state of realization where the very concepts of form and formless all don't make sense anymore. Because then the formless is form and form is the formless. And it's just actually one thing appearing two different ways. And that happens in the level of realization or change of perception. But it also has some very important consequences or implications when it comes to living your life. Because then all of a sudden, bam, there you are again, right? You're back, you're here. You're not out there, transcended. You're actually here now. But the difference is, once you've made this sort of metaphorical journey, that you're here in a way where you're not afraid anymore. Because you know there's nothing to lose. You know there's nothing to gain. And that's no longer a place that you hold on to buffer yourself against life. If it's really so true there's nothing to lose or gain, then why would one hold back? Why not engage, you see? And then that becomes a deeper, more mature state of spirituality, almost where the whole notion of spirituality starts to collapse, right? Into sort of just one movement, one happening. And I think it's sort of very, very important, especially now, because more and more people are having these really beautiful transcendent experiences. And now that some people have been hanging out in them for a long enough time, there's a second stage of sort of maturity that's wanting to happen everywhere I go, you know? But to really get this to come full circle from transcendence over here all the way to completeness, the transcendent realization is, I call it a freebie, right? You don't have to do anything. You don't have to earn it. In fact, the only thing you have to do is stop trying to earn it and deserve it and attain it, and it's just sort of, you relax all that and it can come. The other one is different, because in order for emptiness or being or spirit to really function here through this vehicle, it can't do so in a clear way unless a lot of the stuff that you transcended gets flushed out of the system, right? So when you transcend it, you're just beyond it. But to function here, being beyond it isn't good enough, right? Then there's a transformation that actually happens here in the world of, right down to the world of form. And that, of course, means all of your, whatever psychological hang-ups you may still have had, that you transcended. When spirit comes back, sometimes, there they are waiting for you. And those then have to be seen. They have to be also resolved in a more unified vision. But that's a part of it that rarely happens all at once. That's a part of the maturing that's often, for most people, unfolds over time. And for some, it's much easier than for others. You just never know. 15 years ago, pretty much the only thing people wanted to hear about was really the transcendent part. The part of the teaching where there's nothing to do and nowhere to go and just let go and don't focus on practices, just like put everything down, that all the ways you're trying to attain something, and then something powerful can happen. And that was a really new message back then. It was very powerful, and it still is a useful message. And people then had these big spiritual shifts. But now, there's more and more and more people, a lot more people all the time, that are really open and wanting to know, now what? Because what they found is, even if they believe that that was it, because at the moment it dawns, it often feels like, that's it. There's nothing else. And then what so many of them find at some point is, there's more to the story. There's something else. There's some other movement that's happening. And now people are so much more open to that. 15 years ago, very few people even wanted to hear me talk about it. And so I literally, consciously just didn't, because if nobody can hear what you're talking about, then I just decided I'll wait. Because I knew it was going to come. And sure enough, it did. And all of a sudden, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, people were, okay, I noticed not only they were ready, they wanted, because their experience was showing them, like, there's more to this than I thought. And then even in the last year and a half, there's other areas that I've started to talk about that even cut deeper, that people are really interested in, because it starts to give what they're experiencing a voice, a context. And so I find that really heartening, that as a whole, there's definitely an evolution. And that evolution, it doesn't just mean a moment of real spiritual awakening, it's what's happening after that. And that's an evolution as well, that sort of maturity. So that's really nice to see, show up. And that's a real change. I mean, if you want to prove evolution, I would think, from the people I speak with, that would be it. That's it, because now people are like, yes, I want to hear about that.